Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today for our webinar on ABA strategies in school. Your presenters today are Mackenzie Schueler and Matt Roberts. Before I introduce them, I just want to go over a few key reminders. We will have the talk run up until 2:50, 2:55, around that time. The remaining 5 to 10 minutes at the end of the hour, we'll have a question and answer session. Please remember to mute your sound throughout the whole webinar. If you are comfortable, feel free to turn on your video. And if you have any questions that come up or comments that come up during the presentation, feel free to pop that in the chat box and we'll address it at the end of the hour, or you can wait to unmute and ask your question at the end. Like I mentioned, your presenters today are Mackenzie Schueler and Matt Roberts. Mackenzie is currently pursuing an educational specialist degree in school psychology at the University of Utah. Matthew Roberts is currently a PhD student at the school psychology program at the University of Utah as well. We're really excited to have both of you here today. I am going to go ahead and turn the time over to you.
All right, can everyone see that okay? Perfect.
Awesome. Thanks, Mackenzie. And thank you, Annie, for the introduction. Thanks to everyone for taking some time out of your Friday afternoon to be here. We're really excited that we've got some folks here to talk about what we do up in Davis. We work really with a team of behavior analysts and behavior interventionists in Davis School District. And today we're going to talk about our team and how we use applied behavior analysis to help students in schools up in Davis. So real quick, I just want to outline some of the content that we'll cover today. We're going to start with just talking about the BATE team, who we are, what our goals are, and then we're going to move into the special education process, so referrals and the programs that are offered. And then we'll move into our process as the behavior team and a little bit about what our team looks like. And then we're going to walk through a template of the behavior intervention plans that we use that we find to be effective in schools. And then we'll talk a little bit about implementation, consultation, and fading. And then we're going to mention some specific interventions that we use in schools that have been really effective for us. And then if we've got some time left at the end, we'll take any questions that y'all have. And as we're moving through, if a question comes up and you don't want to wait, just go ahead and throw it in the chat. We'll address it as we go. And if not, we'll just address them all at the end. So, all right. So this is a quote that we found that we just thought would be good to keep in mind as we move through some of the content. So we rise by together. So I just thought that was nice. All right, so getting into the actual BATE team. So BATE stands for Behavior Assessment and Intervention Team. So the T stands for team, but we still say BATE team. But so when we're saying BATE team, just keep in mind that T stands for team. But what we do is we work at the district level and provide support to multiple schools. So we'll each have anywhere from like 2 to 4 cases at different schools at a time. And that's always changing depending on student progress and where the referrals are coming from. So Mackenzie will get more into the different classrooms in a bit, but our service level is really broad, ranging from gen ed environments to our most contained classrooms. So with that, our mission is to increase student success within the least restrictive environment by assisting schools to increase capacity in managing challenging behavior. So we're always advocating for the least restrictive environment for students, and that's so that students have as much peer contact as possible. And on top of that, we're helping schools learn and implement strategies for challenging behavior to try to facilitate a better learning environment now and in the future. So moving into some of the goals that are embedded in our mission, improving student behavior, that's a given, but we're also striving to facilitate positive relationships between everyone with a vested interest in the student, and that includes the student themselves. And we're also trying to increase systematic responses to challenging behavior. So what systems do schools have in place for challenging behavior? What interventions are they using? What disciplinary procedures? Are they using positive reinforcement interventions? Are they using punishment interventions? So we want to think about how we can improve those systems to better address behavior at the systems level. And then thirdly, we're empowering teams with the skills to manage challenging behavior. So we're not just going in to solve the problems for them. We want to teach the skills to the staff and provide them with that behavioral expertise. So there's that saying, if you catch someone a fish, they eat for a day. If you teach someone to fish, they'll never go hungry again. So a big part of our purpose is spreading that knowledge of behavior and advocating more for its use in schools so that schools are successful on their own when it comes to behavior. All right, so a little more in-depth look at some of the services we provide. So a big one is assessment. That involves accurate and consistent data collection, which can then be used to inform our decisions and the development of stronger interventions. And then for interventions, we can use that data to make sure that we're implementing interventions with fidelity. But we're also looking at prevention, so catching behaviors on the front end. A lot of our interventions focus on consequences, so what happens after the behavior, but focusing on those antecedent interventions and setting up the environment to can really reduce the risk of challenging behavior. We're also providing coaching, so providing that proper training and teaching the fundamentals of behavior is really crucial for making our interventions last. So for example, something like differential reinforcement for challenging behaviors might seem obvious to a behavior analyst, but some teachers have never been taught to ignore challenging behavior. So something like that can be really challenging at first. And so we want to spend that time in the classroom coaching teachers and supporting them through that process. All right, so before we get into some of the thicker content, I want to just clarify a few terms. I'm sure a lot of us here are familiar with these, but just really quickly, a BCBA is someone that has received graduate level training. They've passed a national exam and completed a set number of supervised hours. They're primarily trained to assess behavior and then use those assessments to develop individualized interventions. And an RBT, a registered behavior technician, they have 40 hours of coursework, and they've also passed a national exam and physical competencies. They don't need the supervision hours that a BCBA does to get the certification, but they do need some of their hours to be supervised in order to maintain their certification. And a behavior interventionist is someone who's still trained to deliver interventions. They've received that training and coaching for behavioral strategies. And so just comparing the three, a BCBA, they've completed the graduate training, they've done the pre-service hours, they've passed a national exam in behavior analysis, they can provide supervision, and they're trained to assess behavior and develop interventions. Whereas RBTs and behavior interventionists, they're trained, they do have training and they're trained to implement those strategies that are developed by the BCBA. And oftentimes they're involved in that developmental process as well. Okay, so with that, I will turn it over to Mackenzie.
Thank you, Matt. So I'm going to be talking about the special education referrals and programs that are in Davis School District, and we're slowly becoming a bit more intertwined into the special education referrals. As most times now, before a student receives a different placement, we have to be involved. So to start with, I just kind of want to highlight some of the stages of the special education referral in Davis District. And so first, we see that a student isn't making adequate academic growth in a subject area, or they're displaying some challenging behaviors that are affecting their learning as well as the learning of others. And so with that said, they start to collect data in the area of concern, whether again, that's academic or behavioral. And then either a parent or a teacher can make a referral to get a special education evaluation. And so after that initial referral and consent is received, the school psychologist will start to conduct the assessment. We'll do observations of the classroom as well as a file review. And so also based on that concern as well, we might involve related servers like a speech language pathologist or an occupational therapist to also conduct some assessments to make sure that we're thorough and we're addressing all the problems or issues that might be arising. And if there is a concern for the presence of autism, there is an autism team that will come out and do observations as well as conduct assessment as well. And then kind of the last little sequence within special education referrals is that based on the data that is collected during the evaluation phase, they may or may not, the student may or may not qualify for education services. And just as a note, Davis District does use patterns of strengths and weaknesses. And so after, if they qualify, an individualized education plan or IEP will be drafted. And if some challenging behaviors are occurring as well, a BIP might be drafted as well, a behavior intervention plan. And that's kind of where we step in a little bit. And so based on the testing, placement is based on that data. And so we might see students who may be coming in cognitively lower or are struggling with some adaptive skills, things like that. They may have a different placement than other students, just to give them more one-on-one small group support. And then lastly, the IEP meeting is held and students begin receiving services and moving into their new placement. So with that said, I want to talk about some of the programs within that students can receive as a part of receiving special education services. So most often students go to the resource environment. All of these students receive additional instruction and support in various areas like reading, writing, social skills, and they'll most likely spend the majority of their day attending general education classrooms. For those students who might be a little cognitively lower and they're having difficulties with academic growth, social growth, and communication, they will be placed in a more structured small group environment and self-contained. And they'll often push into general education with assistance from a classroom aide that's there, but they will receive more focused, targeted interventions related to the 3 areas that are outlined there. And then the classroom or placement that we interact with the most is social behavior. And so oftentimes when a student is displaying some challenging behaviors within the resource classroom, they the often referral is to place them in a social behavior classroom to help manage those challenging behaviors. So it's a self-contained setting with a focus on challenging behaviors. They will try to mainstream the student within the general education classroom, but that's contingent upon their behavior and whether or not they're able to keep themselves and others safe. And so they use the special education and general education curriculum depending on where the student is at academically and how much instruction they may have missed in previous years. And then the next program within Davis is Essential Elements. And this is something that a student wouldn't necessarily move through the resource classroom for. This is for students who have ages 3 to 22 who have significant disabilities in areas of adaptive, academic, or cognitive abilities. So mostly those students who have been diagnosed with an intellectual disability. And this is a self-contained classroom with occasional one-to-one support. We see a lot of students who might have more medical, or they're considered medically fragile and things like that within that classroom. And these students aren't typically displaying any challenging behaviors as well. And they do attempt to mainstream them as much as possible with that teacher aid support. And so the most intensive setting within Davis School District is the Behavior Communication Intensive Support Classroom, or BCIS. And this is a program for students who haven't been successful in previous self-contained placements. So they would have kind of moved through all 3 of these, or all 3 of the EE, the ASC, and the SB classrooms. And they haven't been successful, or they were putting themselves and others in danger. And so they require more intensive supports with behavioral and communication skills. And the last kind of program that I think is really cool that Davis offers, it's not necessarily related to behavior so much, but it's the Vista Education Campus. And it's for students over 18 who are on an IEP and they require that additional vocational training, and they're entitled to services until age 22. They have some really cool programs that they do. They have it's what's called a pop shop, which is similar to Swig and Fizz, and they teach the students how, to handle cash, take orders, and make the drinks and things like that. So a lot of really cool opportunities there that I just wanted to highlight. So kind of thinking about the roadmap of the special education referrals In addition to our process, which Matt will go into further, I just want to give a quick overview. So after a student is qualified for special education, they'll enter the resource classroom unless other testing suggests they need more intensive supports that, for example, an essential elements classroom might offer. And then as behavior concerns arise and the team attempts to implement interventions and they collect data, and they don't feel like they're successful with their interventions, they're starting to consider placement in a special program. And most often we see that's a social behavior classroom. And so with that said, the mild moderate facilitators who oversee the resource classrooms make a referral to our team. And then we intervene and start collecting data. We implement a BIP or help them create a BIP if needed, and model behavior skills to the school team. And then if that student isn't successful with our help, or they're requiring significant support that we don't feel is sustainable for the resource classroom, we then can suggest to the IEP team that a different placement might be beneficial for the student.
Okay, so now we're going to move into more in depth talking about our process. So this will be kind of an expansion of the end of that roadmap that Mackenzie was covering. But it starts out with us receiving a referral from the special ed facilitator. And then once we get the referral, we'll assign one of our staff, either an RBT or a behavior interventionist, to go observe and collect data and provide initial support depending on the level of severity. And once we do that, we will contact the team and the facilitator, let them know when the staff will be there and what they will be doing. And then we'll take some time to review the student materials. And so we'll look at the BIP or the IEP. If there is one, we'll look at test scores, developmental history, family history, etc. Really anything we can get. And then after that, we will reach out to the school site and see what they've noticed, and talk to them about what they've tried. And what we've noticed is that combining our goals with the school psych on the front end can make a really big difference in terms of getting things in motion with the school and getting to the root of the problem faster. So this is a really important step as well. After that, we will schedule our observations, and then we will complete those observations. And so we'll be doing all kinds of data collection, ABC, frequency, intensity. It really just depends on what works best for the target behavior. This is also when we would typically consult with members of the students team to get a more in-depth perspective. So talking to teachers, principals, anyone who's available that's willing to chat. These can be conducted on the phone or even through email, but face-to-face conversation generally provides the best results, at least in my experience. Plus, it puts a name to our face if it's our first time in a school. Introducing yourself in person can make school staff more comfortable with you and just more comfortable sharing information. So once we have the data, we'll schedule a meeting with the team, and then we'll meet with the team. So that's when we'll discuss a plan of action. And if they don't have a BIP or they needed some help writing one, we will have had one by this point. So we'll go over that. We'll talk about what we are seeing and any sort of recommendations that we would make. And then we will set some behavioral goals and schedule a follow-up meeting. And then we'll break away to spend some time implementing that plan of action and see what happens. Let it settle in for a few weeks and let any flaws rise to the surface. And then we'll have our follow-up meeting to talk about progress and talk about any adjustments that we might need to make. And once we have those adjustments in place, we will just sort of cycle through that process, just continuing the plan of action, changing it as necessary, following up as needed, and then eventually fading out our involvement. Okay, so here is essentially what our team looks like in terms of organization. So we've got 4 teams, and each team is generally led by a staff member with a lot of experience. So it could be an RBT or a behavior interventionist. Really just depends on how long they've been in schools and what kind of expertise they have. So each team leader will report to the BCBAs. And this isn't super strict, like all of the staff can still report to the BCBAs. This just having it structured this way really helps a lot with efficiency, especially, for example, on Fridays, we all meet as a team And then we have some time during our meeting to break out into our teams into small groups and talk about our cases. And then the BCBAs will rotate between the groups to talk about concerns. So it really just helps things move along a little smoother.
So I'm going to go over the Behavior Intervention Plan, or BIP, format that we or our supervisors made that I think is really valuable and provides a lot of really great information. And we're attempting to try to get the school districts to kind of adopt this and put this into their formal system where IEPs and whatnot are written and kept. So hopefully within the next year or two, we see that this is starting to be implemented a lot more, but this is typically what we fill out and attempt to give to the school team. So if the school team hasn't written a behavior intervention plan, or it's not currently addressing the behavior concerns that are present, or it's outdated, we'll help them to develop a bit for them to consider and implement. And so I'll just kind of move through the different different headings that we have in our BIP that give a lot of really great information. So we start with the related factors that might be affecting a student's target behavior. So we might take into account their developmental history, different strengths and weaknesses that they have, any medical concerns, cultural considerations, how they are interacting socially, and other factors that are just important to consider when we're attempting to target the student's behavior. And so as we dig into it, we start to look at their students' preferred items or activities. So different social activities that they might like. So for example, the student that I have filled in, he really enjoyed playing on the playground with his friends. And he enjoyed the activity Imagine Math on his iPad. And in regards to physical and tangible items, really loves fidgets and blocks and whatnot. And then for people, Miss Ford is his general education teacher and had a really great relationship with her. And adults in general, or anyone who would really listen to him talk, he really was reinforced by those individuals. So I think this is really great to consider when, especially as we think about how we want to make things reinforcing. And so this is a really great resource to kind of look back and see if we're being reinforcing enough. So then we'll present observable data, so that hard frequency, duration data from observations, any graphs that we might have made related to the behavior. And so this is specifically looking at, I just did a momentary time sample on this student, and I just enlisted a breakdown of his behaviors. And so with that said, we can kind of, in comparing this to a peer, and we can kind of look at how he's doing in comparison, as well as have all of the data in one place for the school team to consider. So it's not all spread around, and they have this all in one place, like I said. And so then we move into operationally defining the challenging behavior, or the behavior that we want to decrease. So for this specific student, we were hoping to decrease elopement. And so in this, I defined what elopement is, and then what it isn't. So that way we're not always being punitive towards the student, and there's no confusion, and all of the staff can be on the same page as to what we're tracking and what we're focused on. So for example, I said that elopement is defined as any instance that NW leaves the classroom without letting staff know or without staff direction. And when staff are aware that he's supposed to leave the classroom or has been instructed to do so, that's not considered elopement. And when he disregards staff instruction to wait and runs to the requested location ahead of staff, that's considered non-compliance rather than elopement. So making those distinctions can be really important because oftentimes there can be a lot of confusion as to what's the target behavior and what are we really attempting to decrease. And so then next we move into how we would operationally define the replacement behavior, or the behavior that we want to increase. So for this student, again, we wanted to increase functional communication. And so I outlined some things that I would really think would be beneficial for this student in increasing those skills. So for him, it was asking staff for a break, going to a designated break area when he's feeling frustrated, and then letting staff know when he's feeling frustrated or upset, and being given time to de-escalate. without prompting in a safe designated area. And so then asking deep briefing questions and being prepared to move back into the classroom upon being in a calmer state. And then also providing those social skills services to focus on emotional regulation and expressing his emotions appropriately. And then sometimes we'll give a recommendation for the social skill program that might be helpful for them. So in this instance, I was specifically addressing that. I would love to say that they would teach the zones of regulation. And next is this escalation map, which I think is incredibly valuable. And even on consultation cases where we're not always working with the student one-to-one, or we don't have an RBT or BI out, I'll often give this to those individuals so that they can understand when this behavior happens in the student, this is how I can respond. So it's kind of looking at all of the areas of escalation and what we might consider dangerous all the way down to a calm state. And so when the student is very escalated and they're physically aggressing towards staff or peers, the staff can look to the other side in the staff response box and know that, okay, this is when I should use my safety care strategies. And oftentimes resource teachers and general education teachers aren't safety care trained. And so I might take more time here to explain different strategies that we might use to help de-escalate a student. And kind of moving down, so when they're in the orange or when I see them eloping from the classroom, so the student really loved to elope from the classroom from non-preferred tasks. And he would run around the school and try to play tag with you. And so in that instance, we knew that he was trying to get our attention because he was bored. And so with that said, even though it was really hard for the teachers to understand, we would withdraw our attention. So we didn't reinforce his behavior. Because it can be really kind of hard as a teacher to see a student running around the school and no one's following them. But as long as we have the correct procedures in place, like we let the office staff know that, hey, the student is running, please watch your cameras, and we're waiting right here, kind of thing, and making sure that we had all of our bases covered in that sense. And so for this student, when he noticed that he was starting to get sort of escalated, he would crumple up his papers or his homework paper. And so in that sense, we want to prompt him to express how he's feeling and choose different calming strategies, or we can offer choices between tasks. So that way he feels he has some control over what he'll be doing. And then when they're green, they're actively engaged in the classroom material and participating. We really want to be up on that positive reinforcement, verbal praise. And this student could earn a fidget after he completed his classwork for 5 minutes. And really just being enthusiastic and heavy on the positive reinforcement so they understand that they can gain this kind of attention when they're engaging in the desired behaviors. And so then next we look at the level of severity of the behavior. So we look at what are just disruptive behaviors moving into dangerous and very dangerous. And so it can be relevant here to kind of also apply these to the escalation map. And so some just disruptive behaviors that we might see are the students just ignoring teacher directions, they're off task. For this student, he liked when he was bored, he would like poke pencils through his clothes. And so that's just disruptive behavior. It's not necessarily harming him or anyone else. And we knew that if he was starting to get escalated, he would make these noises and that we could start to kind of work some de-escalation strategies in there before a full escalation happened. And some dangerous behaviors that we might see are elopement or attempting to hurt staff or climbing lockers, things like that. And then when those very dangerous behaviors might be physically aggressing towards staff, peers, or other objects. So then we would start to kind of look at the surrounding events of the behavior. So those setting events, you know, did they eat breakfast before school? Did they get enough sleep the night before? What is kind of the background events for what might be triggering this student that we can consider. And then we'll look at the antecedents, so what happens directly before the target behavior occurs, and then their consequences of what's happening after that target behavior. Are they getting adult attention? Are they able to escape the task? Or are they getting access to tangibles, things like that? And then really related to that, why is the student behaving the way they are? What's their function? And like I said, it could be escape, access to attention, tangibles, and those sensory opportunities. And so then kind of digging into how we want to measure this, we would consider outcome measurements. So what will we measure that will help to determine progress towards their goals? And so for this student, we were measuring compliance through precision requests. So we had a data sheet that had how many directions he followed in regards to the precision requests that were given, and then tracking how often he was able to follow those directions when the very first direction was given, and recording that as progress towards his goals. Also looking at those intervention strategies, what are we going to do for this student? What are some antecedent strategies that we can provide, or consequence strategies that we know have worked for this student in the past? So for example, antecedent strategies, we might use a timer and give time warnings to indicate when we're transitioning to a new task, or for consequences, really understanding that providing that behavior specific praise to when they are using skills in the manner that we want them to, or reminding them to use skills when they're starting to struggle. Yeah. And so then we also consider the teaching strategies that are necessary for both the student and the staff. And so for this student, we were looking to also provide social skills for personal space, emotional regulation, following teacher directions. And because the student was homeschooled the previous year, we really were keen on trying to further understand and teach how school and teacher expectations are, what's expected of him at school, and how and why we want to have a calm body while we're at school. And then those critical supports. So what daily supports are critical to implement the list of strategies? So really, what are the daily materials needed in order for our BIP to be carried out? So for example, this student, some of the strategies we provided were having a break cart. So we would help them kind of come up with these materials and have them available and demonstrate how we might use them. The student, we also were recommended using a visual schedule, and again, to track that compliance, a precision request data sheet. So Matt's going to talk about implementation, consultation, and fading.
Okay, so before we get into each one, I just want to mention what we mean by each of these. So implementation is all about providing interventions with fidelity and maintaining effectiveness, maintaining efficiency, and maintaining feasibility. Those are all really important for us. Consultation has really two essential components. One centers around contacting and meeting with all of the relevant stakeholders. And the second involves providing that training to school staff so that the team is self-sufficient once we fade out our support. And then fading is essentially just gradually reducing our presence in a classroom or with a particular student. It is a bit of a balancing act because we don't want to go too fast. Otherwise, we can't properly ensure maintenance and skill acquisition. But at the same time, we don't want to go too slow so that a sense of permanency is established. Some reliance is understandable, but ultimately we want the schools to be self-sustainable in their interventions with students. So moving into implementation, some things to consider when thinking about how to implement effective interventions. Validity. So is the intervention targeting the behavior that it's supposed to target? So if the student has some other really great behaviors, we want to be careful not to accidentally suppress those behaviors. We want to target the challenging behaviors while also maintaining student strengths. And then reliability. So if the intervention requires us to do something over and over again, will it maintain its effectiveness? Will it continue to do the same thing? And then looking at the results, what does the data say? Is the intervention actually doing anything? And then looking at those results, how can we interpret them to make the necessary adjustments so that our interventions will maintain their effectiveness over time? Again, these are all things that come easier with really solid data collection. So that's a big, important part for our process. All right, so efficient implementation. So resources, thinking about what resources we have available in schools, like how many staff does it take to implement the intervention? Not all classrooms have multiple staff. We might just have one if it's a gen ed classroom or even a resource classroom. And so when we're designing our interventions, we need to be considerate as far as feasibility in terms of resources. And then thinking about time. Most interventions require a pretty good deal of consistency. And so we do want to be mindful of how much time we have. So thinking about holidays, spring break, and the end of the year. I know, so Davis is on spring break right now, and the end of the year will be approaching soon. And so we're starting to enter that time where we need to be thinking about how much time we have left until the end of the year. Can we start an intervention and actually have it be successful for the student in the time that we have left? And then setting up the environment. So minimizing setbacks by setting up the environment can really speed up implementation and behavior change. So for example, it can even be something as simple as setting up a seating chart, just something to minimize the potential for setbacks that can hold up the behavior change process. Okay, so consultation. Really, we've talked about a little bit about this already, but a big part of it is contacting all of the stakeholders and having those conversations. We want to get as many diverse perspectives as possible. So these are all folks that could be a member of the team. It's not an exhaustive list, but we might have counselors, speech therapists, teachers, parents, administration. Some of the best consultations I've had, or at least some of the most informative, have been with recess staff during recess. Oftentimes behavior goes untrammeled at recess, and so it can be a great time to get some really objective data and talk to the recess staff about what they're seeing. And then of course we want to include the student in this process. It's usually a good idea to get some objective data first before getting to know the student. Otherwise they just get really excited when you're around, and that can change behavior a little bit. But we want to be careful not to exclude the student from this process, and we can learn a ton by having those conversations with the student about their experiences in the school. So a quick note on fidelity. So arguably the two biggest components of our job is good data collection and good consultation. And there's a reason for this. Getting all of the perspectives to fully understand the environment and then taking tons of solid data ensures that everything we do for the student is specifically for that student. Fidelity for us and for schools in general is really the key ingredient for success. All right, so talking about fading a little bit, we want to support with initial implementation, but our staff are limited. We can't stay there forever, and we do want the schools to ultimately be self-sustainable. And so we do need to eventually fade out. So we do make sure to allow enough time to get a working intervention in place, or interventions, and then we provide time to make sure that the teachers are getting the training, as well as the school staff, to learn those necessary skills to continue with the interventions. And then at that point, we will gradually reduce our involvement. So fading out might look like if we have an interventionist spending a full day one-on-one with a student. If we see that go well for a few days and we want to start to fade out, we might switch to having that interventionist spend an hour or half of the day on the other side of the classroom, while the other half is still spent one-on-one. And then if that goes really well for a few days, then we might spend the whole day or 2 hours on the other side of the classroom. It really just depends on the student and the plan and how much progress we're seeing. But eventually we would slowly fade out in that manner, moving out into the hallway, outside of the school, and then off of school grounds till eventually we're not there anymore. And this is a really great way to ensure that we provide that coaching as well, because when the interventionist is on the other side of the classroom, they can be there to provide that coaching for teachers and help to teach them how to provide that intervention for the student and how to interact properly. So.
Awesome. So I am going to go over some interventions that we use in various classroom environments. And Matt, you might have more experience with some of these than I do, so please feel free to jump in because there's quite a few. So like I was talking about with the behavior intervention plans, for the student that I was working with, we were tracking precision requests and how well he followed those. And so when we're using precision requests, we're attempting to gain compliance and then if they don't follow through with the request that we've given, we follow through with a pre-planned consequence. So I really love this graphic because it kind of goes through, the arrows are a little confusing, but it really provides a great sequence for how you might move through the different requests when you're attempting to give these. So you would start out with a general statement just saying, hey, Susie, come here. And then if they're not following that general request within 5 to 10 seconds, you really want to be mindful of the student's ability to process and how quickly they might process information and directions. And so giving enough time for them to respond so that we're not being overly punitive. And so if they don't follow that general request, we would move to please. And so we would then say, Susie, come here, please. And then if she complies with that, we would immediately reinforce her coming to us. But if there's non-compliance there, we would then move to the need request and say, Susie, I need you to come here. And then again, if there's a compliance, we reinforce that. But if there's non-compliance, then we follow through with a pre-planned consequence that you might have laid out with the student before based on interventions that you might have done previously. And so I think that this can be really helpful for teachers, especially because it kind of gives the student time to process. They hear the direction at least 3 times, and it kind of cuts down on the nagging that might go on in getting the student to comply with directions. And so really when we're giving these requests, we want to be about 5 to 10 feet away from the student, so we're not yelling, and then again, being mindful of that processing time for the student to follow directions. And then a really common intervention that we'll use specifically in resource classroom is the use of break cards. And so they can have several different contingencies with break cards. So you could have a student, earn their break card through several instances of compliance or completing their work, things of that nature. Or you can provide 1 or 2 non-contingent breaks throughout the day. So they know as soon as they get to school the next day, they have 2 break cards waiting for them, and they might have between 2 and 5 minutes for a break. And they know having a place to take their break, like for example, in a resource classroom, they might be able to just give this to their general education teacher, walk down to the resource classroom, and then go to the break area and have some pre-planned activities that are appropriate for break while they're there. The idea is to really be independent with these, and so students are able to mediate and engage in some self-monitoring of their own behavior, their own feelings. So obviously that comes with a lot of emotional regulation skills, things of that nature. So students are able to do this successfully. We do see these in more restrictive environments, like in the social behavior classroom or the ASCs. We typically have students, or at least I've observed in those classrooms where they are raising their hand and asking for one and not necessarily using a card. But the cards can be useful for general education teachers specifically, so they know how many breaks that student might have taken throughout the day. And something that we use for students who might be younger or they might be nonverbal and be using PECs or some other assistive communication device, we would use a visual schedule and a first then board to kind of let them know what's happening throughout the day, and so they can understand the expected tasks. And so something that I have found really helpful, especially for my students with autism, is they really enjoy, or one of the students I worked with has really enjoyed being able to put an X through the completed box so that he knows what he's done with that. He doesn't have to do it again during the day. So it's something that's visual and can really help them understand what's expected, and that they're done with that. They don't have to do it anymore, but also letting them know what to expect. And being able to, something that can be helpful too, especially with the Velcro on the visual schedules, is being able to move things up or down, especially if they completed it before, or it's been expected to be done, or if they're choosing to do another task before the one that's specified. And then the first then can be also really helpful for students to understand, you know, these are our choices right now. This is the boundary that we're setting. So we're going to do reading first, and then you can have a break. So understanding that, you know, we have to do this first before you can have your reward, things like that. And then a token board is also really, they call it a penny chart in Davis District, but I think it's more commonly known as a token board. So this provides students a visual for the reinforcement they might be able to earn, or the goal that they're working for. So for students who maybe don't need as much high reinforcement, or they're able to kind of, it's not as salient, they might use this 10 frame here at the top. And they might be working for computer time, a break, specific fidget, or something in the prize bucket, things like that, that lets them know how close they're getting to their goal. And being sure that, you know, it's also good for teachers and us to know like that we're providing this consistent and immediate reinforcement when we see the target behavior being displayed. And so they know that once they've done a specific behavior, they can earn a star, or a lot of these are customized for like Minecraft, or I've done ones like with snakes and stuff for my clients' specific interests and things like that. And again, they can use various schedules of reinforcement with this, so it might be more variable, or this is a really great place to start when you're attempting to give more continuous reinforcement to the student. Another thing that's really useful in a resource environment is the daily behavior tracker, or it's kind of not full-blown like check-in, check-out, but definitely has some of that feel and some of the aspects from that intervention. And so this can be helpful as students kind of carry it around to different teachers, and they might, depending on the student and where they're at developmentally. So for example, this one that I have at the bottom is for a kindergartner. And so I would have him go and check in with the teacher at the end of the class period or the end of the subject. And she would help kind of go through this with him and talk about, oh, you know, did you stay in your seat the whole time? Did I have to ask you to stay in your seat? Were you following directions each time I asked? And did you keep your hands feet and elbows to yourself? Or, and based on the number of prompts that he would be given or that he needed to follow the direction, we would mark that with a smiley face or a frowny face. And then based on their specific goals, we can track whether they displayed any aggression towards people or other objects. And this note section can be especially helpful if the students are switching between classes, or if, like for example, to a prep teacher, or if they're taking this home and parents can see how they did for the day. And so the goal for this is to, you would set a specific goal most oftentimes. If you're really trying to get buy-in, I've started as low as 60% of, attempting to get 60% of the points available so that they were able to contact reinforcement. So at the end of the day, they could get their prize from the prize bucket or whatever reinforcer that was decided upon. And for students who are in junior high, so all students in Davis have a personal device or a provided laptop. And so I've done in the past where I've made a Google form, and they can do these same ratings, obviously with more numerical values than smiley faces and frowny faces. And that way it goes into an Excel doc, and the person who is administrating, or like the special education teacher who's overlooking the student, can see how the student's done throughout the day and provide the reinforcement as necessary. So really the goal of this tracker is to provide information on behavioral expectations and help a student work towards a goal. And so the one that I have here is one that I've used more so in a junior high setting as well. And so you can see the numerical data, and this is a rubric that was created in the social behavior classroom, but we've started to apply it in other classrooms like resource, so that way we can gain data based on compliance. And whether or not the student was disrupting their learning and learning of others, and how often they were able to redirect. So again, we would set a goal, same concept and everything, just different kind of criteria for how they would earn, let's say, a 4 versus a 2 or a 1. And so next we'll look at a level system. And I wasn't previously aware of this intervention before Davis, but it's used quite a bit, and they're frequently used in the social behavior classroom, and it might be classroom-wide that this is applied. I've also seen it applied individually to students in a resource classroom. And what this does is it lets the student know where their behavior lies and the consequences for their behavior. And so as you see at the bottom, oftentimes there will be several behaviors that might warrant like an automatic yellow, or like moving you down to yellow. So all students at the beginning of the day will start at the top level of level 3, and they'll have access to their highly preferred items and lots of reinforcement, things like that. And as you know, for example, if they start to engage in physical aggression towards objects, they might move down to yellow, and then they might not be able to earn some of the more highly preferred items. They can still go to recess and things like that. But if once they start aggressing towards others, that's automatically in the red zone or level 1. And they are asked to be in the resource classroom, and they're not able to earn some of those highly preferred items. And so with that said, in order for the student to move up, is different for each student or within different classrooms. So they might have to follow some directions or engage in some restorative practices in order to move up. That way, we don't want to make it so punitive that they're staying down in level 1 for all day. We want to make sure that they're able to move up quickly and receive lots of positive reinforcement. Another one, I'll just kind of go through these quickly because I know we're running out of time, is classroom within a classroom. And often this is used when a student might be overwhelmed by whole group instruction, or they're displaying some disruptive behaviors that might be somewhat dangerous for the whole group. And so we are trying to separate them so that no other student gets hurt or they get hurt. And so it's just kind of setting up a desk or a workstation in a different area, and they complete their work there. They still can be integrated within the classroom, but they might have more one-to-one support. And then a BCIS classroom, which if you remember is the most severe placement in Davis. All students, like the whole BCIS classroom is set up. They each have their own individual workstations that they're at. So that way, you know, they're individualized, and students are able to kind of have their own space that they can retreat to. And so some miscellaneous interventions that we might use, just to kind of go over a few that we might use, are use of timers. So this is allowing for a specified amount of time a student has to engage in a task or something to earn a reinforcer or to engage in a preferred activity. And I think this works really well with a lot of students. For some reason, it's kind of like magic using a timer sometimes. And providing choices. So when we provide choices, we might provide 2 or 3 options. So that way the staff and the students feel some control over what activity the student might engage in. So for example, we might say, okay, we can do this math sheet work first or the reading sheet first. And so the student has some control over what they're picking, and the staff also feels that some work is getting done as well. And then this allows for a boundary to be set. So the student has one or the other, and in order to earn the reinforcer, we have to complete one of them. The withdrawal of attention, I think I noticed this in the BIP as well. So if the student is engaging in really disruptive behavior to gain attention, we might withdraw our own attention to be helpful. So that way we're not accidentally reinforcing a behavior. And then once we see that they're following directions and they're engaging in the behavior that we'd like them to, we'll reinstate that and provide lots of positive reinforcement. And I guess I should note during that time, we really still want to have our eyes on the student, but really trying to be neutral in our responses and our reactions. And another one that is used quite frequently, I think, is dots for motivation. And it's for students who might attempt to escape academic demands. We might put like garage sale dots on different problems of their behavior on their worksheet to indicate what questions they have to do. So they don't feel like they're doing the whole thing, but they're still completing work, which is really the ultimate goal. So yeah, I hope that you guys kind of learned something about Davis and what we do there and how this model for applied behavior analysis can be integrated into the schools. And hopefully, you know, you're able to take something away and apply some of these strategies in your own setting. So yeah, if you guys have any questions, we'd love to answer them. I know that we covered a lot of information in a short amount of time, so we really appreciate any questions you guys have.
Yeah, that was a lot of content. Thanks everyone for sticking with us.
One big virtual round of applause for Matt and Mackenzie today on presenting on a huge topic. Sort of like what they said, we will be opening up the rest of the time that we have left to any questions or comments. Feel free to drop this in the chat or unmute.
I agree, Lauren. The escalation maps are the bomb. It's been really great in being able to list out some very general strategies and then give those to teachers. If I'm just consulting it with them and they haven't given us a full-blown referral to come step in and intervene with a specific student.
Yeah, I agree with that. A lot of times, teachers aren't taught explicitly how to respond in some of those situations, and so having a quick colorized map that they can refer to can be super helpful for helping them know how to respond. Ooh, that's a good question, Molly. When you say ABA, do you mean what we're doing in Davis or just ABA in general? In Davis.
I think for me, it's just seeing some of the successes, when you do have kind of tying in what Elizabeth asked. So some teachers, since we're kind of a box to check before they move to a more restrictive environment, some of them might be a bit more hesitant or not as open-minded as we'd like. We're just kind of a box to check before they get rid of a student that they feel they really disruptive to their classroom. And so that when we do have a teacher who is really kind of gung-ho and really open to all of the strategies that we presented and the data and whatnot, and is really taking accountability, I think that's one of my favorite pieces is feeling I feel dealing with the kids is a lot easier than the adults sometimes. And so having those successful consultation experiences is really great.
Yeah, similarly, I was going to say something along the lines of student success in general. It can be really hard to implement interventions in public schools. There's a lot of people involved. There's a lot of layers, and it can be hard to get them off the ground sometimes. And I will say sometimes the failures hit a lot harder than the successes, but when you do have a success, it just feels so good. Like Mackenzie was saying, I think a lot of the time school staff will almost they'll lose hope in the situation, and so they'll bring us in, and it's well, if the behavior team can't fix it, then we have to move the kid. And so that puts a lot of pressure on us. And so when we're in that situation and we do see the success, it's so huge because we help the student access that least restrictive environment. And that's a great feeling. So yeah, student success, I think, is my big takeaway.
Awesome. If there are no further questions, we're going to go ahead and conclude today's webinar. Again, one big virtual round of applause for our presenters today on a great presentation on all of the amazing work that you're doing in Davis School District. This webinar is recorded and will be published to the UTTEC Lab website and YouTube channel. You can access the UTTEC Lab by going to u-tteclab.com. Again, thanks so much, everybody, and hope you have a great day.